Welcome to another episode of Mind of Adolfo. And I want to start this episode with a provocative question. Why do some land disputes never end, no matter how many wars or treaties or protests? So today, we're going to dig into two of the most volatile land disputes on earth, which would be Kashmir and Palestine. And we're going to uncover some of the historical roots, the power politics, and the global pattern behind them. I noticed that these are highly charged, highly emotional, controversial topics. So this is not to undermine the suffering of the Palestinians, for example, or the suffering or the injustice done in Kashmir, if you will, by the Indians towards the Pakistanis or vice versa, right? This is sort of a breakdown of the situation and the geopolitics and where this all stems from. I will say, though, that violence never solves anything. If violence was the answer, then the issue in these two lands, like in many lands, would have been settled long ago. And we could always draw lessons from history. I always like giving the example of Vietnam. Again, there's a lot of great books on the Vietnam War, documentaries on the Vietnam War. Ken Burns does a really great job. I think it's like a 10-part series on Vietnam. And it's, again, what would create the most VC or the Viet Cong, this was the resistance in the South and Southern Vietnam, was just one Marine patrol going through your village, and the next day you would create 10 more or 20 more VC troops. And hence, now you win the Hearts and Mind War when Americans forward deploy or any, big power is going to deploy to a smaller country, if you will, a country not, equal in proportion in military might or economic might or things like that. So I want to break down the origins of all this because in both places, these were British mandates. So prior to World War II, Palestine was under the Ottoman rule and then went over to British rule. And India was also a British mandate. So they have colonial origins. This is true. This is a product of colonialism, which is one aspect of the origins of the situations in these places. The second aspect would be the Cold War, right? Post-World War II, as to why things are done. Because you hear a lot of criticism towards Israel, well, to the U.S. government towards Israel. So why do we support Israel? What's the big deal? We should cut the funding. But then when you look into the geopolitics and you eliminate the humanitarian aspect of it, you'll notice that you have the Red Sea and the Straits of Hormuz over there. And these are geopolitical choke points. These are straits where oil and import and export and resources flow through. So it's vital for the U.S. to have a presence, let's say, here in the Middle East, right? We have no forward operating base to launch an attack, if you will, let's say on a country like Iran, if you don't have an ally in the region. And I know it's cold, and I know it's callous to say it in such a way, but these are just realities that we live in. Of course, you also have the issue of funding Israel, right? So they had funded about $3 billion a year. And what that does is feed the military industrial complex because you pay Israel, you give Israel money, $3 billion, and then they go ahead and they give it back to the U.S., but they give it back to Northrop Grumman or Raytheon in weapons, right? It's feeding the weapons industry. Think about it. These industries that have existed for a long time, these corporations have existed for a long time, what's feeding them, right? The U.S. isn't constantly at war, but it's constantly testing its new strategic weapons. And what better way to test a weapon if you don't have to fight the war yourself? You give it to your allies, you see how they perform in the field, and you're getting real life quality assurance on the bombs, on the weapon systems, on the delivery systems, and so forth. And they use it as case studies for future wars. That's not to say that it justifies any war crimes or genocides or the bombing of civilians. But again, there's always a geopolitical reason for these things happening. For example, if you think about it, the U.S. or any empire, as far as that I know of in history, and I'm no expert, I am just an enthusiast of history and of geopolitics. But from the little that I've read, you'll notice that any empire doesn't reward loyalty as much as it rewards utility. And this, unfortunately, is vital because these countries, like say, for example, the U.S. or Britain, are looking for their own self-interest, right? Or for the people's self-interest. They want to ensure energy resources. They want to have naval dominance all over the world. Example, South China Sea. Why is the South China Sea so important? Why is Taiwan so important? Is it because they make semiconductors? Maybe. Right? To make one semiconductor takes like 9,000 processes. Not like we couldn't make them here. But you also have the South China Sea, which if you start building ports and naval carriers and battleships, destroyers and so forth, we could challenge U.S. hegemony over the oceans. And that's something that China desperately wants. That's why they're building the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, right? Think about it. They import, I think it's something over 50% of their agricultural products from the U.S. and their energy. So we wouldn't need to really go to war with China as much as just block those key strategic points for them via the Navy. And you can starve a country to death. You could turn off the lights, essentially. So there's always a bigger geopolitical reason as to why things unfold the way they unfold. And, we see the outcries on TV and we see the blood and the bombings and so forth. And we also criticize it, as we should. And we ask questions like, well, why are we funding these guys and not the good guys? Well, who's the good guys? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is the Saudi royal family the good guys? I mean, we're funding them as well. They're a monarchy. And I think they've killed about something in the magnitude over the order of 200,000 Yemenis. With, again, American manufactured and produced weaponry, just to give you an example. But today I want to talk about India-Pakistan because this is one that's not really highlighted a lot in the news outlets or news cycles. But these are two nuclear powers. These are two countries that are mortal enemies. They're bitter towards each other, and they're pointing nukes at each other. Historically, India and Pakistan have been one country. I mean, when Alexander the Great, quote unquote, went into India or conquered parts of India, he essentially conquered Pakistan. So like historic places like Sogdia or Bactria, which is something like northeastern Afghanistan. This is considered the areas of conquest of Alexander the Great. And once he passed the Hindu Kush and entered the Indus River Valley, which is in Pakistan, but hence Indus River, right? He was in India. So when he met King Porus and had many battles there with the Indian kingdoms, this was predominantly in Pakistan. I don't think he got to the south of India. His troops might have died of malaria or something. But so we're going to go over this. And it's not like my other episodes I've done. I've done like 50 episodes, and they're much more, again, structured in their narratives on certain topics and issues. And here I just want to sort of like flow, if you will, freestyle on some issues. So my other episodes are a little bit more charged because I'm responding to comments that people make. And I think I took the wrong approach. So I have to apologize to my listeners. I want to show you a little bit more of my personality. But I really dislike disingenuous conversations, or if we're going to fundamentally start a conversation, we have to have some objective truths. We have to start with history, and we have to start with context as to why things unfolded the way they did. You always have to look back. Again, because I always say we didn't, the wheel didn't start turning the day that we were born. There were predecessors, there's things that happened before, and these are lessons that we learn not to commit in the future and to avoid genocides and wars and bombings and atrocities and war crimes and so forth. So it's always good to be informed. Again, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I'm going to try my best to cite sources at the end of this episode. So if you guys like, you could go research yourself a little more, dig a little deeper, and just be better informed. Because when you're better informed, again, knowledge is the cure to ignorance. Knowledge is the cure to evil or to hate. I'm very much with Eastern traditions on this. I don't believe in good and evil. I believe in wisdom and ignorance. So here we go. So let me give you a case study. I wrote some notes down here. India, Pakistan, and Kashmir. I know you heard this on the news recently between India and Pakistan. So 1947, British, India, pre-1947 is a British mandate. So British partition of India takes place in 1947. So India's created, right? Two nations are created, which is India and Pakistan. And then you have the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, and they had a Hindu ruler, but they had a Muslim majority. And he chose to accede to India after a Pakistani-backed tribal invasion. And of course, you have something very similar happen in 1947, which happened in Israel in 1948, which is the displacement of people. So you have, the Muslim population of India. There's a lot of massacres, a lot of turmoil, a lot of people being displaced and migrating to Pakistan, and then from Pakistan, vice versa, to India. Now, the UN, they come in, they call for a plebiscite, but it never holds, and then the line of control splits between Kashmir, India, and Pakistan. So that would be the equivalent of, the 38th parallel. This is one of the most heavily armed places on earth, and this is sort of the origins or the source of the conflict in India. They have about 3 wars, and it's still an ongoing conflict. So they have a war in 1947, they have one in 1965, and they have one in 1999 called the Kargil. And again, in 2019, India revokes Article 370, which is autonomy of Kashmir. Kashmir wants autonomy. And then in 2025, we have the Pahalgam attacks, which they renew military escalation. And like I mentioned earlier, they're both nuclear countries. Both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and any flare-up is a global concern. And again, this has been ongoing. A lot of people lost their homes. A lot of people are the victims of a lot of injustice. You could say, again, some of the Hindus that live in Pakistan, some of the Muslims that live in India, massively displaced, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. And again, very similar to the conflict going on today, or it's been ongoing, but just right now the one's making the headline is Israel-Palestine. So to go over Israel and Palestine. It has much deeper roots, but we're not going to get into the whole story. I just want to start from the most recent, which is 1947. So again, Palestine is a British mandate, and during World War II, post World War II. So there's a UN partition plan in 1947 to accept the Jews and move them to Palestine. Again, but there's been an ongoing migration of Jews even before World War II, right? This took place in Europe because of pogroms and blood libels and then all sorts of just nasty things going on to the Jews in Europe, the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So the Zionist movement begins, and they start, looking for a homeland. And presumably, they have this fantasy of going back to the motherland, if you will, right? Going back to the roots, going back to Judea, right? Hebron, to the ancient kingdoms of Israel. And this starts a nationalist movement. Again, for generations, the Jews lived in Europe. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew, you're probably from Russia or Eastern Europe. And if you're a Sephardic Jew, you're probably from Spain. And if you go even further back in history, again, these Jews were also displaced by the Romans in 70 CE, by the Emperor Hadrian, after a Jewish revolt, and he finally exiled all the Jews. So people aren't, how do I say this? It's not that they're not originally from the Middle East, but it's sort of like saying, let's say you live in America, you're an American. At some point, because there's many different types of American, right? There's very much a lot of diversity in America, but we're going to start with, say, with the 13 colonies, right? Say you're from Massachusetts, or you're from Boston, you're from Vermont, or something like that. Maybe you have well-established family roots that you could trace back maybe 200, let's say 300 years. Maybe you have ancestors that came from Great Britain, maybe they came from Ireland, maybe from Scotland, maybe from the Netherlands, maybe from Germany. But 200-300 years later, how German are you? How British are you? You're not, right? America formed a national identity 1776, right? This is obviously inspired by the French Revolution, because that's pretty much the birth of nationalism. So America has like a national identity, but it's a little different with the Jews because they unfortunately, they were never able to be assimilated into European culture. That's not to say that no Jews assimilated into European culture and just became, European, depending on where they were living, say Spain or France or wherever. But if you think about it, there was always, I don't know if this is true of Europe in the past or not, but Europe seems to me always have an assimilation problem, unlike America, right? You come to America from a foreign country, your children are going to be very Americanized, right? They're going to watch American TV, listen to American music. They're going to talk in a colloquial fashion in America, depending on what region they are, and they're going to be full-blown American. But with the Jews in Europe, they were never allowed to hold like political office. The ghettoization of Jews began in Europe, right, where they could only live in certain neighborhoods and only hold certain jobs. So, banking and money lending essentially is an invention of the Jews. This is something they did to survive. You look this up in the history of Venice. This is where they sort of, the saying goes, give me lemons and I'll make lemonade. And this is what the Jews did. And of course, since they kept it, sort of forced to keep to themselves and not assimilate, they kept their heritage, their culture, which is deeply tied to their religious traditions, practicing Shabbat on Fridays, washing their hands. Again, plagues in Europe, bubonic plagues, 13th century Inquisition, blood libels. Before Shabbat, Jews, they wash their hands, just like Muslims, right? Wash before prayer. And they weren't as affected by plague as the rest of the Europeans. But again, Europeans thought that it was sorcery or witchcraft or whatever, and just found a reason to go ahead and massacre Jews. So, but let's go back to 1947. So 1947, the Jews are accepted, but the Arabs or the Palestinians, they want a state, but that's rejected. So this turns into a civil war, and Israel's declared a state in 1948. And then Nakba happens. So this is where 700,000 plus Palestinians are displaced, removed from their ancestral homeland. These are Palestinians that have been there for multiple generations, and you could totally understand their cause, right? This narrative that they're colonizers is untrue. These are people who've been here for multiple generations, right? If you've been in America, since 1776, let's say your family's been here since 1776 or before, you're already an American. You're 4, 5, 6. Oh no, if it's today, let's say you're 20 generations deep already. But it's the same thing for the Palestinians. You can argue that the pioneers and the settlers in America took indigenous lands and manifest destiny, and of course that happened too. But this happens all over the world. People migrate all over the world, and the Palestinians are a diverse people. They have a rich history. They've been in the region from time immemorial. So again, this is very sacred to them as well. And you have 700,000 of them who were displaced in 1948. So this happens. And then fast forward now, 1967. So 1967, Israel has a 6-day war, right? And what's today Gaza is controlled by Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula. But in the 6-day war, Israel goes ahead and they capture Gaza, they capture the West Bank, and they capture East Jerusalem, which are places that are historically populated by Palestinians. And of course, then you have ongoing settlement buildings, military occupation, and a form of legal apartheid, right? Because of this tension, right? You have this very visceral anti-Zionist movement going by the Arabs towards the Jewish population. And it's understandable if you could show some empathy and put yourself in their shoes. So, and this is not a anti-Israel rant or a pro-Palestinian rant or topic, but let me give you an example. Let's say in a microcosm, something much more benign. You're going through a custody battle for your children. And anybody who's been through this, who's listening to this, understands the frustration. And once you know how the sausage is made in the American court system, it makes you want to vomit. It is, for lack of a better word, fucking disgusting. And you might have supervised visits, or they tell you when you can see your kids, or you're going through some, again, family courts, you're going through divorce. Maybe you lived in this home with your former spouse for 20, 30 years. Your children were raised there, and now you lost your home, right? Be it the wife or the husband, doesn't matter. Happens all the time. Emotions are high, tensions are high, and the feeling of helplessness in that situation is high. Anybody's ever lived that, again, very extreme for the individual, obviously not as extreme as, apartheid, open air prisons, militarized zones, constant bombing, no water, no food, or no clean water. So things of this sort. But we're going to scale it all the way down to something, again, much more simpler, a custody battle, something for your children, something that's sacred. And again, for the Palestinians, like just for anybody else in the world, their land, your homeland, your home, your children's home is sacred. And the Jews feel the same way. They feel the same way on the opposite end of the spectrum, because they feel like they have no home. They've been kicked out of everywhere they've been to, right? There's always some flare up or some reason to hate the Jews. And again, you could always go back in history and do these Monday morning quarterbacks, say, what if, right? Well, what if they would have, again, maybe built New Jerusalem in Bavaria or maybe somewhere else, right? But it didn't happen. So now you have, again, 4 or 5 generations of Jewish people living in Israel, again, a diverse population. Most of them secular, some of them orthodox. Just like in America, right? You have a very agnostic, progressive population in America, but then you also have a very conservative religious right as well. And it's not really representative of America. It's just it's a complex society with many different viewpoints, and you could say that the same about Israel. Okay, so anyways, let's go back to the story here. 1967, so Israel captures Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and again they have ongoing settlement buildings, military occupation, and this apartheid state. There's no resolution in Oslo and Camp David, failed peace processes over and over again. The status of Jerusalem as well, up until recently, or refugee returns. And again, till today, the statehood is unresolved. Unresolved for many reasons. Again, many geopolitical nuanced reasons. It's not so simple as to say just Israel should just give them the state, or that's it, just give a two-state solution. It's that simple. It's not that simple. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And it's not even that simple for the Palestinians. Palestinians are ruled in the West Bank by the PA, Palestinian Authority. Then you have, I think, the remnants of the PLO, Fatah, which was Yasser Arafat's party. And then in Gaza, you have Hamas, which is the more militarized, militant, hardcore streamliners, totally anti-Zionist, from the river to the sea. They want to occupy the entire region, the entire land. And they are Islamists as well. So they resemble more of like the Muslim Brotherhood and extreme groups like this. And the Palestinians don't want that either, but they don't want to corrupt, Palestinian Authority, PA, either, running the show, right? Because the PA was promised, by the Israelis, cooperation, be the strategic arm of Israel in the West Bank, keep the people in line, and we'll give you a state eventually. But again, you have rampant corruption. They're very authoritarian towards their people. And again, this goes back to the analogy of a Marine patrol in a village in Vietnam. Every time a innocent Palestinian dies, or a child dies, or they bomb a massively populated area, you are creating more resentment towards not just Israel, but say to the Palestinian authorities not doing anything about it, and more sympathy toward groups like Hamas, who are, at least in their viewpoint, in their eyes, fighting the Death Star, right? Fighting the bully. In this case, ironically, the Goliath is Israel, and the David is the other party. So that's their viewpoint, their worldview as of now. And it's very visceral. If someone kills your mother, your father, your brother, sister, your entire family, or you lose a leg, you're not going to give a shit. You're going to go and, revenge is a very human thing, a very human reaction, very human emotion. And it has nothing to do, in my opinion, with religion, even though religion is a force multiplier as well, right? Add any, religious zealot to this to fuel that fire, and it just becomes unstoppable. So again, before I finish, let me make some parallels here. So again, they both have a colonial legacy, British, with the British Mandate, the British India, and the British Mandate of Palestine. They both have partition, the Hindu-Muslim division, and again in Palestine, the Jewish-Arab division. Disputed territories. So again, in India and Pakistan, you have Jammu and Kashmir, and in Palestine, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And you have military occupation. India controls 60% of Kashmir. Israel controls the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And the religious dimension as well. India, Hindu, Muslim, and of course, Palestine, Jewish, and the Muslims and the Christians. Except that with India, Pakistan, you have a nuclear risk, and Israel has undeclared nuclear weapons, but highly doubt they're ever going to use them. And the global involvement, of course, you have the UN and China, and they're all watching closely because, again, China has line disputes as well. They have a line dispute with Siberia, with Russia. They have Taiwan. So, again, these land disputes are global. And the U.S. directly funds Israel and for strategic purposes, right? To have an ally in the region, to control certain critical choke points, if you will, for transport and for the Navy. So you can look at other places in the world. Greek and Turkey are fighting over Cyprus in the Western Sahara, Morocco versus Sarawali people. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And like I mentioned before, South China Sea. So to end this, why do these disputes last for decades? Because again, they're not just about maps, they're about memory, trauma, power, and who draws the border and who's drawing the border. So and the question is who enforces them. So what happens when the land remembers, but the people forget what it costs to take it? And again, whether it's Kashmir or Palestine or Cyprus, these land disputes are never just about geography. They're about their identity, their survival, and who gets to write the future history. So I want to end this with a quote. And it goes, can peace come without justice, or does justice require borders that finally stop bleeding? So, like always, guys, remember to, lift more, eat more, rest more, love more, hate less. And I'm going to mention some quick sources real quick. You can look at the CFR conflict tracker. Al Jazeera's Israel-Palestine timeline is a great source. The Washington Post, Kashmir history. To look at the Human Rights Watch, Kashmir report, and read on UN resolutions on Kashmir and Palestine. These are some great places to start to research this. So I'll leave you with that. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it informative. If you hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.